In this chapter, we're going to take a look at Chapter 19, Drifting Towards Disunion. So looking at what caused the Civil War, amongst many other things, we'll start to look at those years right before the actual secession. As far as literary influences, we started to get some important books, getting people to think in different ways, especially about slavery as the root cause of this war. So in 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe publishes her influential novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. And it stresses the moral evil of slavery. It's a fictional look at a specific slave figure. And it's very sympathetic. This increases, and it gets a lot of people thinking and actually wanting to do something about slavery and making them more active. Many people were angry about slavery before, but now this has got a story that really hits the heart. And so abolitionist protests increased in the North. More refused to follow the laws, especially the fugitive slave law of the North, requiring that anyone who made a slave in the North must be turned over to their owners. And a lot of people in the North just refused to do that, especially after reading this novel and really being hit by it. It's a bestseller in America. It sells 500,000 copies in this first 5 years, so it sells quite a bit. 1 in 5 people had a copy of this. So it's selling well in America, but also in the UK and France, and so that means key allies are going to be less willing to support a slaveholding South. So here's Harriet Beecher Stowe. So with this novel, it really gets people thinking differently about slavery. This is her house. It is the most boring gray house I have ever been to. It's in Connecticut. Oddly enough, she lives right next to Mark Twain, who has the coolest house I've ever been to. It's much shinier. Here's his parlor. It's one of the most beautiful houses I've ever been to. If you're ever in Connecticut, check it out. And yeah. Another major book to look into, Hinton R. Harpers. He's a non-aristocrat from North Carolina. He writes The Impending Crisis in 1857. And so this is not a fictional book. It's not a story. This is more of a sociological book in that it just looks at the statistics and raw numbers of slavery. And it attempts, and it angers just about everybody. Everybody hates this. Slave owners, blacks in the South, even Northerners aren't that impressed by it. But it attempted to use statistics to prove indirectly that the poor whites, the non-slaveholding whites, which were the majority, 90% didn't own slaves, were the ones who suffered the most from slavery. And so in the end, it's another impact as far as trying to prove that slavery isn't evil. First it was about morality, now we're looking at the raw data and economics of how slavery can impact others. Moving on to Kansas. So supporters and opponents pour into the new Kansas territory to win the vote over slavery. So under popular sovereignty, everyone's going to run into Kansas as a new territory. Once they have enough people, they can vote on a new constitution, but for that constitution, they're going to vote pro-slavery or anti-slavery. And so both sides push a whole bunch of people to move in and make it pro or anti-slavery. Reverend Henry Ward Beecher, that should be Ward Beecher, he raises funds to supply northern settlers with rifles as they move in, aka Beecher's Bibles, as they see this as a religious cause. As the election neared, we also get a group of border ruffians. And so these are guys that are crossing the border into Kansas to illegally win the vote. So they don't even live in Missouri or live in Kansas, but they cross the border to vote pro-slavery, hoping that slavery will expand. It doesn't really work out. As far as who wins, it doesn't matter because they reject the results. Both sides reject the results. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery governments are set up in Kansas competing against each other. Nebraska wasn't even up for grabs. It's just too far north to really grow crops well for slavery at the time. And so it's a pretty nasty battle starting in Kansas where you get both sides. And then it starts to get real bloody. Abolitionist John Brown moves in. He believes God wants him to fight slavery. So he's a very religious man, but also possibly crazy. It's debatable. 1856, Brown leads a group, including mostly his sons, to kill 5 pro-slavery men. They are killed and cut up with broadswords in front of their home at Pottawatomie Creek. After that, he's a fugitive. He even grows the beard to basically disguise himself as he is a fugitive for murder. This continues. He just kind of starts this The territory is called Bleeding Kansas for incidents adding up to about 200 murders on both sides. As far as Kansas statehood, by 1857, after just a few years, Kansas had enough people to apply for statehood. And to keep the Free Soilers from creating a free state, the pro-slavery politicians created the Lecompton Constitution. And this means that the people still get to decide on slavery, but people that already brought their slaves get to keep their slaves. So it's the question of whether or not they're going to expand slavery. But as far as what it is already there, they're going to leave that alone. The compromise, eventually they do compromise. They reject this old constitution, and Kansas just remains a territory until 1861. So they just really cannot get along and figure out what to do with their state. And it gets bloody on the floor of the Senate as well. Abolitionists, so 1856, abolitionist Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, he makes his big speech condemning pro-slavery men, insulting South Carolina as a center for slavery. In response, a South Carolina representative, Preston Brooks, beats Sumner with a cane to unconsciousness. So he gets beat pretty bad, but this is on the floor of the Senate, where we're usually respectable somewhat. And it's pretty bad sign of the times. Sumner has to leave America for a while. He goes to Europe to recover, and eventually he does make it back to return to give a speech on the Senate floor for that. But it's getting pretty nasty, both in words and actions. New political parties start to rise up. By 1856, it's a very different political landscape. The Whigs were gone. They were split over slavery, and they just kind of dissipated and split off into different parties. Lincoln used to be a Whig, but eventually he becomes a Republican. The Democrats split off into two parties, Northern and Southern Democrats, over slavery, and so that's not working out for them. We get a couple new parties. One of the stronger parties is the American Party, also known as the Know Nothing Party. They supported nativism, so it's all about xenophobia, fearing immigrants. They took our jobs and all that. And they fear Irish Catholics because they have a different religion and they don't trust them. They fear the Germans because they fear they're going to take their jobs and try to bring in German culture like hot dogs. My God. So they're very much the anti-immigrant party. Then there's the Republicans, and they emerge as this new party. 1854, opponents of slavery in the territories form a new party known as the Republicans. John C. Fremont's our first candidate. He's the big hero of the Mexican War, the hero that basically took California, and so he's very much against slavery expanding as a hero of the territories. As the party grew, it took on elements of the other dying parties. So some of the Free Soilers that didn't want to expand slavery, some of the anti-slavery Democrats from the North, some of the Whigs from the North, some of the Know-Nothings, but largely it's just the Northern Party. Northern Democrat James Buchanan wins the election of 1856 with a promise of unity, hoping that he can keep everything together. As a Northerner and as a Democrat, he's hoping to hold it all together, but largely he's a very weak president. He makes promises, never really follows through. He's a one-term president, and ultimately just didn't do enough to stop this war from happening. Dred Scott. Dred Scott, he was a slave who had lived in free areas, so he was in the South. Then his master took him, and they lived in the North for a while. So the question is, if he's in the North, is he still a slave? If he's in a non-slave state, but he moves with his master for a while, is he still a slave? So it goes to the Supreme Court. And 1857, the Supreme Court rules that it rules against him. It rules that Dred Scott is property and not a person, citing the Constitution, above all, is there to protect our right to life, liberty, and property. Going back to John Locke. If slaves are property, the government cannot take your property. So he meant well, Dred Scott meant well, trying to get his freedom. In the end, it made things a whole lot worse. So slaves do not have the rights of citizens. They are considered property. They are at the level of a horse or a mule, according to the Constitution. And Congress, therefore, cannot forbid slavery's expansion into the territories because Congress cannot take away your right to property. So it expands slavery drastically. And then the economy crashes. The Panic of 1857 breaks out due to California gold, all these 49ers showing up with gold, pumping it to the economy, leads to a lot of inflation in the currency, plus over-speculation in land and railroads. People were buying a lot of land, hoping and they would borrow money to buy that land, and eventually they couldn't really afford it, so they'd have to pay back the money that they borrowed, but they never made money off the land. And so it's a bit like the housing crisis in 2008. People bought really expensive land, then they couldn't pay their bills. The banks asked for their money back for the loans. They couldn't give the money back, so the banks fail. And so we get bank runs, bank failures, inflation. The economy is wrecked, very similar to the 2008 crisis. The North is hit the hardest because there's a lot more northern banks. The South, depending on cotton, they're doing fine. So the Northerners need help. They want something to fix it. So they want the government to give out free farming land to pioneers. So all these Northerners that lost money out here, their goal is, they owe a whole bunch of money, so their plan, let's just leave and go somewhere else and start a new life. Let's just forget about those debts, run away. And so that's their goal. Just hopefully the government will give away free land because we have all this open land. All the areas in red, there's open land for the government to give away. Eastern industrialists feared that all this free land would drain its supply of workers. So all these poor workers hoping to move, that's going to hurt the northern factories. The South was worried that the West would fill up with a bunch of free soilers that would not allow the expansion of slavery. And so this would unbalance the Senate, resulting in a whole bunch of anti-slave states. Regardless, Lincoln does approve this in 1862, and is the Homestead Act, in which a whole bunch of families move into these areas to get free land from the government. And this continues for a long time, all the way up until 1986. We were still giving away land in Alaska. And there's still a whole lot of free land in these areas, but we discontinued the program. And that's even how my family moved into North Dakota from Canada. LincolnDouglas Debates. 1858, it's a race for the U.S. Senate in Illinois. Very hotly contested between the little giant and the actual giant. Republican Lincoln, very tall, and Democratic Douglas, Stephen Douglas, very short, known as the little giant, in that he's a pretty short guy, but very strong, very powerful, good speaker. It's one of the most celebrated debates in U.S. history, and its main topic is slavery. So it's just a series of debates as they are on the campaign trail, going back and forth in cities across Illinois, and it just becomes really famous. It hits the newspapers. It's celebrated ever since. Douglas's plan, as far as slavery goes, let the territories decide for themselves. Lincoln's plan is, no, we need to pass laws to stop the spread. Eventually, Douglas does win. He keeps his Senate seat. But also, Lincoln gets a lot more famous. So Lincoln, his status in the Republican Party elevates. And so it could have been maybe his larger plan to go for the presidency, and that he does lose this one, but he's going to win in the long term. Meanwhile, John Brown decides to take action. So beyond just the occasional raid, he wants to start the Civil War. He's hoping for an entire slave rebellion on the level of Haiti. So while politicians were debating the slave issue, John Brown said, no, let's go for it. He wants a major slave revolt. 1859, Brown leads a band of 21 men, including his sons, black and white men, into Harpers Ferry, Virginia. Harpers Ferry has an arsenal. It's where the U.S. Army keeps a whole bunch of their weapons. So the plan is to go in, seize all the weapons, and then distribute to all the slaves to start the Civil War. Problem is, he gets all the weapons, and then none of the slaves want to join because they're worried that they're going to die. They're worried that it's not going to work out. And so he gets the weapons, and then he gets surrounded by the townspeople, and he's stuck inside the arsenal. So he's got all these weapons, but only 21 guys are actually there, and eventually it doesn't work out. And the Marines come in, led by Robert E. Lee, who's going to be very important later on. Brown is captured, tried, and executed. And so in the North, he becomes a martyr to end slavery. In the South, this is showing that the Northerners are becoming drastic. The Northerners are getting violent. And so it just makes things worse. And maybe that's what Brown wanted. So tensions very much increase. Election of 1860, Republicans nominate Abe Lincoln. He was the second choice. Mostly he was chosen because he's newer, less corrupt, and less unliked than the main candidate was Seward. And so the Democrats were split over slavery, so it's all these other parties that are split, but the North is pretty much united behind Lincoln. And so it's a four-way race, but Lincoln's going to win. He wins with about 39.8% of the popular vote. So he has one of the lowest popular vote wins of the presidency in American history because it's so split. So the majority of Americans did not vote for Lincoln, but he still won. And he didn't win with any Southern electoral votes. It's just those Northern votes, but the North has a higher population, so they get more votes in the Electoral College. And so he squeaks by and gets that win completely without the South. And here's a little cartoon showing that. Lincoln heading through these tracks, but the Democrats, represented by the donkeys, are split, with the Southern Democrats and the Northern Democrats, they represented here, they collapse over the issue of slavery. And so this smaller candidate with only 39% of the vote, he comes and wins away. If the Democrats were all united, if all the other parties were united, they would have beat Lincoln easily, but they're split over slavery. And so here's the rundown, here are the numbers as far as all this. And so Lincoln wins the popular vote by 39.8. If these other parties, if the Democrats had united, they would have beat Lincoln. Plus the Constitution, John Bell, the Constitutional Union, which is a very bland version of can't we all just get along? So with Lincoln winning, it's over for the South. They're ready to go. They don't trust him. And so Southerners act quickly and they start to secede and break away. South Carolina is the first to secede from the Union in December, I believe it's December 20th of 1860. Right before they leave, a senator known by his name, John Crittenden, he comes up with a compromise, a series of amendments to the Constitution trying to hold on the South. Makes all these promises like we're not going to mess with slavery forever. We're going to write an amendment in the Constitution guaranteeing slavery forever. It gets tabled, and by the time it's up for a vote, it's just too late. The South's gone. So Southern delegates meet in February of 1861, and they form the Confederate States of America with Jefferson Davis of Mississippi as president. And so first the Deep South breaks away. Then we get these states break away because once the battle starts, so we get a first attack at Fort Sumter, then these southern states break away. These states in blue up here, they're slave states, but they are known as the border states, and they keep slavery, but they remain in the Union. And one of Lincoln's main jobs is to keep those slave states, really hold on to them as a key neutral territory. And that's it.